Japan has 260% debt to GDP. Why hasn't it collapsed? This is the story of how a country piled up a mountain of debt so massive it should have buried its economy decades ago, and somehow the whole thing is still standing. If you're worried about where the U.S. is heading with its own borrowing, you need to understand what is happening in Japan, because Japan arrived at this destination first, and the lessons are not what most people assume. Let's begin with the number that should not be possible. According to Japan's Ministry of Finance, the gross central government debt sat at 324 trillion yen at the end of March 2025, which is a 1 and a 3 followed by 21 zeros. The IMF pegs general government gross debt at roughly 234.9% of GDP. Trading economics puts the figure closer to 248%, and by some broader measurements of total public liabilities, the number creeps near 270% of GDP. For perspective, Japan's historical average sat at 152%, and when Greece detonated its economy, its debt to GDP topped out at 179%. The obvious question becomes, why isn't Japan turning into Greece? Why hasn't the bond market revolted? Why hasn't the yen imploded? Why are pensioners still cashing their checks every month? The answer comes down to 4 things almost nobody talks about. So let's walk through them one at a time. Reason number 1, Japan owes the money to itself. This single fact matters more than anything else in the story. Per Japan's Ministry of Finance, 88.1% of Japan's government debt was held domestically as of December 2024, and foreign ownership has only crawled up from 7% in 2011 to about 11.9% in 2025. That still leaves roughly 9 out of every 10 yen Japan owes flowing back to its own citizens, its own banks, its own insurance companies, and its own central bank. Here is where the math turns surreal. The Bank of Japan alone holds 46.3% of every outstanding government bond. And once you strip out short-term treasury bills, the central bank's grip climbs to 53.2% of the entire domestic government bond market as of June 2024. Insurance companies inside Japan hold another 15.6%, domestic banks pick up 14.5%, and the rest gets absorbed by pension funds and ordinary savers. Picture what that arrangement actually means, because when the Japanese government pays interest on bonds owned by the Bank of Japan, that interest essentially loops right back to the government, like writing yourself a check and depositing it in your own account. That is fundamentally different from Greece, which borrowed in euros it couldn't print from foreign creditors who could pull the plug, and Japan simply cannot get cut off from its own savers. Reason number 2, the debt is denominated in yen, and Japan controls the yen. Greece couldn't print euros. Argentina couldn't print dollars, but Japan can print yen, and it has aggressively. The Bank of Japan can purchase bonds at will, and that is exactly what it has done for the last quarter century. After the bubble burst, zero interest rate policy kicked off in 1999, quantitative easing followed in the early 2000s, and in April 2013, under Abenomics, the BOJ rolled out what it called quantitative and qualitative monetary easing. Then in September 2016, the central bank introduced something called yield curve control. explicitly targeting the 10-year bond yield at around 0% and the short-term rate at negative 0.1%. The BOJ transformed itself into the buyer of last resort and eventually the buyer of first resort. None of that mattered because the math kept working anyway. This is why a trade known as the widowmaker has destroyed hedge funds for over 30 years. Because global investors looked at Japan's debt, ran the numbers, and bet against Japanese government bonds, and they got crushed every single time. Investopedia literally defines the term using JGBs as the textbook example, and the lesson was always the same: bet against Japan, and the Bank of Japan will simply keep buying. Reason number 3, Japan's net debt is far smaller than its gross debt. This piece almost never makes it into the scary headlines. Yes, Japan owes 234% of GDP on paper, but the country also sits on an enormous stockpile of assets that offset that liability. A working paper from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, authored by economists Cheen, Cole, and Lustig, consolidated the entire Japanese public sector balance sheet, including central government, local governments, public pension funds, the Bank of Japan, and public financial institutions. What they uncovered as of the second quarter of 2024 reshapes the entire conversation. Because gross liabilities came in at 270% of GDP, assets reached 192% of GDP, and net public liabilities clocked in at just 78% of GDP. That figure sits below the United States, and it is roughly in line with Germany historically. The 260% debt-to-GDP headline is technically accurate, but it is painting half the picture. The story keeps getting better from there. Those Japanese assets aren't sitting idle in a vault collecting dust, because after 2012, Japan's Social Security reserves were redirected into higher return, riskier holdings, including domestic equities, and foreign bonds. The same St. Louis Fed paper calculated that between 2013 and 2023, Japan's public sector earned annual returns exceeding its funding costs by more than 6% of GDP per year. The government was essentially running a giant carry trade on itself, with its assets earning more than its debts were costing. Reason number 4, deflation made the entire equation work. After Japan's asset bubble peaked near 39,000 on the Nikkei in December 1989, the country slid into what is now called the lost decades, and the Nikkei would go on to shed over 80% of its value across the next 18 years. Land prices collapsed, growth essentially flatlined, and the whole economy drifted into deflation. That outcome sounds catastrophic, and for workers and businesses, it absolutely was. But here is the thing. For a government issuing debt at fixed interest rates of basically zero, deflation becomes a strange kind of gift. When prices aren't climbing, when wages aren't climbing, the central bank faces zero pressure to hike interest rates. And that is when you can borrow trillions and pay almost nothing to service the pile. The result was that even with the biggest debt load in the developed world, Japan's debt service consumed only about 22% of the national budget as of 2023. The problem is, and this matters most for anyone watching from the United States in 2026, that arrangement is finally cracking. In March 2024, the Bank of Japan terminated its 8-year negative interest rate policy. and lifted the short-term rate from negative 0.1% up to between 0 and 0.1%. By December 2025, the BOJ was expected to push rates to 0.75%, the highest level since 1995. And in June 2026, BOJ Governor Kazuo Ueda signaled that the bank is pivoting, in his own words, into inflation-fighting mode, with more hikes likely on the way. Here is what that pivot translates to in real money. Japan's finance ministry just locked in the assumed interest rate for budget calculations at 3.0%, up from 2.0% the year before. Nikkei Asia is reporting that debt servicing costs are projected to consume 30% of the entire Japanese national budget within 3 years, which works out to roughly 10 trillion yen, more than the current allocation. After 3 decades of being dead wrong, the widowmaker trade is finally paying off, and Bloomberg reported in October 2025 that shorting Japanese bonds has become one of the world's best performing trades, with long-dated Japanese bond yields climbing sharply for the first time in a generation. So here is the takeaway, and this is what matters if you're an American watching your own country's debt situation. Japan didn't dodge a debt crisis because debt doesn't matter. Japan dodged a crisis because of 4 very specific conditions: owing the money to its own citizens, controlling its own currency, sitting on massive offsetting assets, and benefiting from deflation that pinned interest rates at 0. Strip away any one of those pillars and the math turns ugly fast. The United States shares some of these advantages. Since America borrows in dollars, it can print, but the parallels stop quickly. A much larger share of U.S. debt sits in foreign hands. The American savings rate runs far below where Japan's peaked at 23% of disposable income in the mid-negative 1970s, and the United States is dealing with actual inflation rather than deflation, which forces interest rates higher rather than lower. Former Japanese Prime Minister Nato Kan warned back in June 2010 of a Greece-like debt crisis, and Fortune magazine branded Japan the world's real economic time bomb in February 2015. Both calls were dead wrong for over a decade, with rates climbing now, with the yen under pressure, with debt servicing about to swallow nearly a third of the budget. The question stops being whether Japan was right to ignore the warnings. The real question is whether the conditions that let Japan get away with 260% debt to GDP are finally running out. And if they are, then the country that wrote the playbook on living with massive debt is about to write the next chapter on what happens when that playbook stops working